Welcome back to another Explainer. We usually think of history as this grand, serious march of progress, filled with brilliant tacticians and epic clashes of civilizations. But sometimes history is just a glorious, unmitigated comedy of errors. In this Explainer, we're going to look at some of the most spectacularly absurd conflicts humanity has ever engaged in. And we are building up to an absolute masterpiece. I'm talking about the grand climax of humiliation, the unbelievable true story of a modern, heavily armed military suffering a crushing defeat at the hands of flightless birds. Yes, you heard me right. Okay, let's dive into this. It's a question that sounds like the premise of a Saturday morning cartoon. What happens when a modern military loses to a flock of flightless birds? We're going to answer that, and the true story is honestly stranger and way funnier than fiction. But to fully appreciate the sheer absurdity of our main event, we first need to set the stage a bit. We need to understand that humanity has a long, proud track record of getting into completely ridiculous fights. Section 1. History's most absurd conflicts. Now, war is terrible, obviously, but every now and then, the history books read less like a tragedy and more like a sketch comedy script. People have fought over the dumbest things in the most embarrassing ways possible. Let me show you what I mean. In 1896, we had the Anglo-Zanzibar War. The British issued an ultimatum to the new Sultan of Zanzibar: step down by 9 a.m. or else. He refused. At exactly 9:02 a.m., the British Navy opened fire with heavily armed gunships. By 9:40 a.m., the Sultan had fled, the palace was a pile of rubble, and the war was completely over. 38 minutes. You could order a pizza, and before it even arrives, an entire war has started and finished. That is the shortest recorded war in human history, less than an episode of your favorite sitcom. And it definitely gets weirder. Have you ever heard of the Kettle War? It was a brief conflict between the Republic of the Seven United Netherlands and the Holy Roman Empire. The grand total of the destruction? A single shot was fired. Just one. And it miraculously managed to hit and completely destroy a soup kettle. That was it. The only casualty of an international dispute was literally dinner. But if you want true, unadulterated incompetence, look no further than the Austrian army's Schnapps blunder. So the crucial point is, an entire army somehow fought a massive battle against itself. The soldiers got wildly drunk on schnapps, started arguing, and in their heavily intoxicated state, completely hallucinated an Ottoman attack. They panicked, fired their weapons, and waged a full-scale battle against their own men, taking heavy casualties before they finally realized the enemy wasn't even there. Section 2. The Animal Draft. When human incompetence isn't enough, we try to weaponize the animal kingdom, and it almost always backfires spectacularly. Just look at these terrible ideas. First, the United States tried bat bombs. They strapped tiny incendiaries to Mexican free-tailed bats, hoping they'd roast enemy targets. The result? The bats accidentally burned down the U.S. military base where they were being tested. Then, the Soviet Union tried explosive dogs. They trained dogs to run under tanks, but they trained them on quiet, stationary Soviet tanks. So in the chaos of a real battle, the dogs panicked at the noise and ran right back under the Soviets' own tanks. And my personal favorite, U.S. pigeon missiles. The famous psychologist B.F. Skinner literally trained pigeons to sit inside the nose cone of a missile and peck at a screen to steer it. The military tested it. It actually kind of worked, but they ultimately scrapped it because it was just deemed way too weird to use. To cap off this weird history of animal warfare, we have the Pig War, a highly tense border dispute between the U.S. and the mighty British Empire over the San Juan Islands. Both sides sent in the military. It almost escalated into a massive, bloody conflict. The only casualty? A single British pig that wandered over and got caught eating an American farmer's potatoes. 1 dead pig, 0 dead humans. History is a very weird place, guys. Section 3. Crisis in Western Australia. Which brings us, finally, to the main event. It is time to slow down and really appreciate the absolute peak of historical absurdity. Imagine the scene. It's 1932, right in the aftermath of the Great Depression. The farmers in Western Australia are struggling to survive, trying to cultivate their wheat crops. And suddenly, they're invaded, not by a foreign army, but by massive, destructive flocks of emus. These are huge, 6-foot-tall, incredibly fast native birds, and thousands of them are just ravaging the farmland. The farmers are completely overwhelmed, their livelihoods are being destroyed, and in absolute desperation, they beg the government to step in and stop the feathered menace. So how exactly does the government handle this agricultural pest problem? Let's walk through the response.
Step 1, they hear the desperate complaints about the massive emu flocks. Step 2, instead of sending pest control or agricultural experts, they deploy the actual military. Step 3, the soldiers arrive on the scene, fully equipped with heavy machine guns and thousands of rounds of ammunition. They treated a bird problem like it was World War I. They brought heavy artillery to a farm fight.
Section 4, Machine Guns versus Emus. The stage is set. It's man versus nature. It is trained military might versus raw, unbridled avian chaos. The soldiers marched into the fields, fully expecting to mow down the birds and be home for dinner. Now, what's really interesting about this matchup is the sheer contrast between these two forces. On one side, you have the proud Australian military, highly trained soldiers armed with heavy machine guns, packing thousands upon thousands of deadly ammunition. On the other side, the emus. Big, goofy, flightless birds. No weapons, no armor, just incredibly long legs and a survival instinct honed by the harsh Australian outback. It absolutely should have been a massacre. But, well, the emus had other plans. Let's talk about emu tactical brilliance, because these birds didn't just stand there. As soon as the machine guns opened fire, the emus executed maneuvers that would literally make a military general weep with envy. They scattered wildly in every direction, making them incredibly difficult targets to hit. Then, they regrouped quickly out of range. They outmaneuvered the trained soldiers at every single turn. They ducked, they weaved, they dodged a literal hail of bullets. The soldiers couldn't get a clear shot to save their lives. The birds were too fast, too erratic, and completely unbothered by human military doctrine. Think about the scale of this failure. Thousands. The soldiers fired thousands of rounds of heavy ammunition into these flocks. The outback was echoing with the sound of rapid machine gun fire. You would think the sheer volume of lead flying through the air would have solved the problem purely by accident, right? But here is the incredibly deadpan reality of this situation. Despite bringing massive, overwhelming military firepower to a bird hunt, and despite firing thousands of rounds, only a handful of emus were actually killed. The military operation was a catastrophic, embarrassing failure. The soldiers were completely exhausted, out of ammo, and the emus were just hanging out, probably still eating the wheat. Let's move to and see how this builds into our final chapter, Section 5, The Feathered Victors. After a month of chasing birds around the desert, wasting taxpayer money, and suffering absolute, worldwide humiliation, the soldiers did the unthinkable. They simply gave up. The commanders looked at the situation, looked at the undefeated emus, and essentially packed up their machine guns and went home. The great military machine was broken by a flock of oversized pigeons. And guys, it gets even better. Because of the sheer embarrassment and the fact that they couldn't even make a dent in the emu population after less than a week of initial highly publicized combat, the government officially had to throw in the towel. Their official stance? Peace declared. They declared peace with a bird. That is not a ceasefire. That is an unconditional surrender to the animal kingdom. So let's put this down in the history books for good. The emus won. There was absolutely no contest. The birds faced down the barrel of a machine gun and simply walked away victorious. The farmers were still annoyed, the military was a total laughingstock, and the emus continued their reign as the undisputed champions of Western Australia. Which leaves us with a rather profound question to end on. If a modern, highly trained army, fully equipped with heavy machine guns, can wage a war and completely lose to a flock of flightless birds, where does humanity really sit on the food chain? Think about that next time you see a bird staring at you. Thank you for joining me for this explainer. I hope you enjoyed this dive into historical absurdity as much as I did. Until next time, stay curious.